the next person we're going to get to is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. And I would say that out of all of the Abadila, he's the least one that's studied. All right, so you have the least biography on him, the least information about him. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Now, his father is Amr ibn al-As. Okay? Amr ibn al-As has one of the most fascinating biographies in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Why? Because he's one of the greatest enemies of the Prophet ﷺ for most of the seerah, most of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. He's extremely intelligent, and he uses that intelligence against the Prophet ﷺ's ummah. He's the one who goes to Abyssinia and tries to persuade an-Najashi to hand over the companions. He plots against the Prophet ﷺ. He fights all of the battles against the Prophet ﷺ. And in fact, the Prophet ﷺ made dua against him. Now here's the thing. Rasulullah ﷺ rarely makes dua against a person. And when he does, it's answered. Right? In the Battle of Badr, the Prophet ﷺ made dua against a group of people. And subhanAllah, those people were found all in one ditch. Abu Jahl, Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt, and others. Rasulullah ﷺ actually mentioned them by name. And subhanAllah, they were all found in one ditch. But when the Prophet ﷺ made dua against Amr ibn al-As, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually revealed an ayah. Okay? And this ayah is in Surah Ali Imran. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, لَيْسَ لَكَ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ شَيْءٌ أَوْ يَتُوبَ عَلَيْهِمْ. It is not for you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. لَيْسَ عَلَيْكَ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ شَيْءٌ. The decision does not belong to you. Okay? أَوْ يَتُوبَ عَلَيْهِمْ. Or if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to forgive them. أَوْ يُعَذِّبَهُمْ. Or if Allah Azza wa Jalla decides to punish them. فَإِنَّهُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. They are oppressors and they're wrongdoers. But you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, will not decide who Allah Azza wa Jalla will punish and who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive. So, Amr ibn al-As is a very unlikely person to come around and become Muslim. But he does, right? And subhanAllah, he spends all of these years trying to sway the people away from Islam, fighting against the Muslims, persecuting the Muslims, going to Al-Habasha, trying to get an-Najashi to hand over the Muslims, using his tricks in Badr and Uhud, in all of these battles. And then he eventually comes around and he becomes Muslim actually 8 years after Hijrah, before Fatih Mecca, before the conquest, when he met Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu. So when Khalid became Muslim, before Fatih Mecca, before the conquest of Mecca, Khalid and Amr ibn al-As were very close. Okay, they were very, very, very close. Khalid gives da'wah to Amr ibn al-As, and Amr ibn al-As becomes Muslim before Fatih Mecca, before the conquest of Mecca. And obviously Amr ibn al-As is someone who plays a very important role in the history of Islam. Conquers Oman, conquers Egypt, conquers many parts of Syria, many parts of Asham. He's someone that, subhanAllah, spread Islam to many, many parts of the world. Plays a very important role in Islam. And that's just, again, how Allah Azza wa Jal rewarded the patience of the Prophet ﷺ, that He gave him his enemies and the children of his enemies, and they became the reasons by which Islam was spread all over the world. Now, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. First of all, I'm going to share with you guys a historical fact, and you're just all going to go. All right? Okay? The difference in age between Amr ibn al-As, and just keep in mind here that things were very, very, very different back then, and people matured at a very, very, very young age. Amr ibn al-As became a father at the age of 12 years old. Abdullah is 12 years younger than his father. So he's more like a brother to his father than he is a son. Amr ibn al-As, one of the descriptions of him is that he reached puberty very, very early in life. And by the time he was 11, he already had the body of a grown man. And subhanAllah, it's just a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He has Abdullah when he's only 12 years old. Okay? So the difference in age is very, very, very small. It's really not like Umar ibn al-Khattab and Abdullah ibn Umar or many of the other companions where you have an old father. No, you find that they interact in many ways like Sahaba, okay, like companions of one another. All right? And this is narrated widely in the books of Sirah. In fact, the books of Sirah will say that the maximum between Amr ibn al-As and his son was 12 years old. So it could have even been a little bit earlier than that. So Amr ibn al-As himself, and Amr ibn al-As's description, he's a big man, someone who matured very, very, very early. And so Abdullah was not much younger than his father. And Abdullah actually accepted Islam a year before his father. So Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, heard the message of Islam, and he came to the Prophet ﷺ 7 years after Hijrah. When he came to the Prophet ﷺ, he wasn't a teenager. He was already in his 20s, late 20s in fact, so he's a little bit older, right? Mid-20s to late 20s, comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and he accepts Islam 1 year before Amr ibn al-As radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and he goes back to Mecca until Fatih Mecca, until the conquest of Mecca. Then he spends the rest of the time with the Prophet ﷺ. He goes and he lives in Medina, settles in Medina with the Prophet ﷺ. Now Abdullah's name is not Abdullah actually. His name is Al-As. His name was actually Al-As. Now Al-As in the Arabic language, what does it mean? What does Asi mean? What does Asiyya mean? The disobedient one. Rasulullah ﷺ didn't like those types of names. Okay? So the Prophet ﷺ, whenever Al-As ibn Amr ibn al-As came to him, he said, by the way, your name is Abdullah now. Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ, he changed his name to Abdullah, which is very common in the seerah, that a lot of people had their names changed. The Prophet ﷺ only changed the name of someone whenever their name had something objectionable. So it's not part of Islam to change your name, but if there's something objectionable about your name, then the Prophet ﷺ made it a point to change the name, and obviously he chose the best of names, which is Abdullah. So Abdullah ibn Amr al-As used to be Al-As ibn Amr. His kunya, his nickname was Abu Muhammad. So he has a son, his oldest son was actually named Muhammad. Now he was raised, and this is the thing, I'm not going to romanticize any of these biographies, all right? We have to be very clear honest about these upbringings. I mean, Abdullah ibn Amr was raised in a very pompous household, a very lavish lifestyle, right? He was raised in a household that was royal in essence. Okay, so he was raised with a lot of pride. Okay, there was a lot of boasting about Quraysh, about being from where they were, about their tribe. There was a lot of boasting in their clothes, okay, and in the way that they looked. They used to eat very lavishly, okay? And subhanAllah, they were people that used to brag about their lineage. They were people that used to brag about their nasab. And in fact, you find in the Khilafah of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, this got one of Abdullah's brothers in a lot of trouble. Why? Because in Egypt, where Amr ibn al-As was in charge, one of the brothers of Abdullah was in a camel race with a Christian over there, with a Coptic, okay? And the Coptic, who was a slave, actually beat him. So he walked up to him and he lashed him on the face, and he told him, do you realize you're dealing with the Ashraf, you're dealing with the nobles here. Who do you think you are? Now that Christian slave went to Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu and told him what happened. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he summoned that son and Amr ibn al-As. He told them, I want you both in Medina. He brought them all the way from Egypt, and he handed that slave a whip, and he said, lash him and lash his father too. Now the slave was like, why would I lash? Amr ibn al-As didn't do anything to me. Why should I do that? Right? Why should I lash him on the head? He said, because his son took pride in him. He boasted about him. Right? So subhanAllah, this is an attitude that was brought to Islam, but the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, especially the Khulafa, they did away with it very, very, very quickly, especially Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, al-Faruq. He distinguishes between truth and falsehood. He doesn't tolerate that type of stuff.